Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. When we last visited Cynthia on her book, John, we learned how John really missed his family when he was on tour. The framed letter that Paul bought for Cynthia and Julian from John brought her mixed emotions. She said he meant every word in the letter, but he didn't change. Sometimes he tried harder with Julian, but he was so preoccupied with other things he couldn't give him much of his attention, the kind that Julian wanted. Whenever John would get home from touring, he was exhausted, and it took him a few days to recover. Cynthia had to keep Julian away from the bedroom door so John could sleep. There was a rule in the home that at 2 p.m. he would get a wake-up call and a cup of tea, and that's when Julian was allowed to see him. Once a few days had passed, John was back to normal and full of energy. He and Julian would go through the fan mail, and he would tell Julian, "These letters are important. They're our bread and butter," and then they would go out to the garden and walk around. John loved being around his son, but in short bursts. He could be impatient. He shouted at Julian for being messy when he ate. And Cynthia yelled back, saying that if he were there more often, he would see how little boys eat. Usually these outbursts were rare because Cynthia and Julian knew when to stay away from John if he was edgy. And while Julian played at their feet, Cynthia and John would sit in the den and eat dinner, and they would catch up on the news and with each other. John would repeat over and over how great it was to be home. And Cynthia's mom would buy things for the house, and John was always excited for Cynthia's mom to go out and buy things. He would tell Cynthia, "Tell your mom we need loads of books for the bookcases and to buy the leather-bound ones." And then Cynthia's mom would go to the sales rooms, and she would get antiques and ornaments for the house. And John loved clocks, and she would look for those. And then John asked Cynthia to tell the housekeeper to buy Rice Krispies and cornflakes. They were his favorite snacks. Then they would become closer, and Cynthia and John loved those times that they could cuddle together in front of the TV. They called it special John and Cyn times. But now drugs start to begin the breakdown of the marriage. John started to get interested in drugs. Cynthia said that all the Beatles were into smoking marijuana for a couple of years, and most of the people in the music industry were doing it, so she didn't object to John using it. It made him giggle, and he would want to munch on things and be a little spaced out, and then it would wear off. But one time, John, Cynthia, George, and Patty went to a dinner party to George and Patty's friends, a man and a wife, and they spiked their drinks with LSD without telling them. Cynthia started to feel strangely, and she was mad that they didn't ask permission before they did that. The host started laughing and told them what they had done, and then they were all so scared they ran out of the house. Well, poor George had driven them there in his Mini Cooper, so he had to get them home, and then it would take an hour for them to get home. Eventually, they made it back to George and Patty's home, and John and Cynthia, being so in no condition to drive, spent the night at George and Patty's. Cynthia said they stayed up watching the walls move, the plants talk, and time stood still. Cynthia didn't like feeling not in control and not knowing what was going to happen next. So John and Cynthia talked about it later. She said the incident convinced her she didn't want to try hard drugs again. John felt the opposite way. He had been shocked and scared like the rest of them, but he was also fascinated. He enjoyed the lack of control and the weirdness, and he wanted to try it again. So he started to take LSD regularly, and George found it fascinating, and he took it again, and Paul and Ringo did too. All the Beatles were cautious with it, but John went overboard with it, thinking it would lead him to enlightenment, creativity, and happiness. But Cynthia, she found it hard to be around him. He would be distant and so spacey, he could hardly talk, making any sense. Cynthia felt like LSD was pulling him away from her. When the drug wore off, he would be himself again, though. At first, his drug taking didn't affect his work. He would take LSD after recording sessions and concerts, not during them. Later, his drug taking got into his songwriting, but at that time, it didn't affect anything. Then John started to bring people home that he had met through drugs. I'm sure Cynthia didn't like that. He would bring strangers home as well as people he knew. And they were high and trashed up the house for hours and days on end. The people would be glassy-eyed and sleep on the sofa, beds and floors, and eat whatever they could find in the kitchen. John, when he was clean, was a private man, but when he was drugged up, he was vulnerable to anyone, and they would take advantage of him. Cynthia didn't like the invasion, and she was afraid for herself and Julian. She didn't want to hear loud music all night or wade through people to get to breakfast for Julian. She was wondering if she would try to ride things out and hope that John would get back to normal. She didn't want to give up on the marriage without trying everything she could, but she didn't want to live with a man who was always in another dimension. John could feel the distance between them, so he started trying to convince Cynthia to start taking LSD again. He kept saying he would look out for her and it would bring them closer. So she agreed, and she wanted to understand why it appealed to him so much. They set a date and then had Julian stay with the housekeeper and her family over the weekend. So Cynthia dreaded it. John arranged for a group of friends to come over and support her. And George and Patty and others came over. They lit candles, put on music, and passed around scotch and coke. Then she figured they must have spiked her drink. Soon she started to feel strange. She went to the bathroom and looked in a mirror and saw a skeleton of herself. And John led her to another room to the den, and he put his arm around her, and she felt better. But then a friend of theirs said something to her, and he had transformed into a snake and then an alligator, so she felt like she was in hell. Then she saw her cat, and it became multifaceted and multicolored. Slowly the drug wore off, and the drugs made everyone intimate with each other, hugging and kissing, and she didn't want that. She didn't want false intimacy with people she didn't know well, and she didn't want drugs. They terrified her, and she thought they were dangerous. She knew she had to be there for Julian. So she told John how she felt, and he didn't try to persuade her again. He kept doing it, though, and Cynthia hoped in time he would get tired of it. But she ended up trying LSD one last time. John and Cynthia were in a Rolls Royce with a group of friends, and everyone was happy, and she decided to join in. She then realized it was a mistake. They were all going to Brian's house, the manager. He was throwing a party there. So Cynthia kept following John around looking for comfort, but John was in a bad mood and treated her like a stranger. Then there was an open window, and she thought about jumping out, but then somebody called her name, and she turned back into the room. It was then she thought her marriage might not survive. So I'll end the video here. The next video has John meeting up with Yoko Ono. I think we all know what happens next, but I'll proceed anyway to see what interested John in a woman so different from any woman he had known before. So I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be great. Also, be sure to click on the notification bell, and you will be notified whenever a new video is ready to be viewed. I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.